Today, we'll be discussing interview and hiring process accommodations. I'm Allison Kushner. I'm the Director of Disability Equity Office and the ADA Coordinator here at the University of Michigan. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Just a few tips. This workshop is being recorded and will be made available on the YouTube channel as soon as possible. The slides will be sent out to all registered participants in the coming days, along with an anonymous survey. And we do hope that you'll complete the short survey as it helps us determine how we can best assist you with your learning goals. And finally, please use the Zoom webinar tips and the Q&A feature to submit your questions. You can do so anonymously as well. ASL interpretation is available. Thank you to our ASL interpreter for being here. And you can click the interpretation and select American Sign Language for that. And CART transcription can be turned on by selecting Show Captions. So just briefly, I'll go over our agenda for the day. Starting off with the fact that the University of Michigan is committed to fostering an inclusive environment where accessibility and the needs of individuals with disabilities are prioritized, ensuring equitable opportunities for all members of our community. Today, we're going to cover quite a few things. We're going to just briefly discuss the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to go through the reasonable accommodations during a hiring process, talk about some accessible hiring practices, onboarding and retention tips, and then we'll discuss some frequently asked questions, and then hopefully have time to go through our interactive activity around interviewing and hiring case scenarios. We want to remind everyone that here in the Disability Equity Office, we're modeling a comfortable, inclusive, and brave space. Your questions are absolutely encouraged, and keep in mind we're all learning together. We don't know what we don't know, and odds are if you're thinking about a question, others are thinking about it as well. So please utilize this as an opportunity for growth and learning. First up is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So just briefly, the Americans with Disabilities Act protects individuals with disabilities, or what we will refer to as IWDs, from discrimination and harassment in various aspects of daily life, including things like employment, public services, and spaces. In the workplace, individuals with disabilities must be afforded equal opportunities in all stages of employment, from application to training, promotion, etc. And employers are required to offer necessary accommodations in those phases. Government services at all levels have to also be accessible, so state and federal, ensuring institutions like universities and other public facilities are open to all individuals, including those with disabilities, as well as business and public spaces, including digital platforms, are required to prioritize accessibility, ensuring that everyone can access services and information. And then less often, but just as importantly, the ADA extends those protections to individuals associated with IWDs as well, safeguarding the right to fair treatment. Fundamentally, the obligation to provide reasonable accommodations underscores the framework, and denying reasonable accommodations in all of these aspects or areas can be considered a form of discrimination. Really briefly, we're going to talk about disability definitions as well as some functional disability groups. This is the legal definition as it is in the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So these substantial limitations are determined by comparing somebody with those limitations to the limitations that an average person in the general public may have, keeping in mind that those with a substantial limitation will have a greater limitation than those who do not have a disability. And then we have the major life activities. Some of them are listed here, but of course, they are not exhaustive. And it also includes individuals who may have a record of a disability impairment, even if they don't currently have a disability. So keeping in mind somebody with a diagnosis previously of cancer who may be in remission currently, that individual may still be considered an individual with a disability. And then finally, the third bullet, we're not going to really touch on too much, but it includes individuals who don't have a disability, but may have been treated as if they did in places like their employment or education. So those functional disability categories refer to classifications that describe limitations in performing major life activities due to physical, sensory, cognitive, psychological, and neurological differences or limitations. These categories are used to help identify specific areas where individuals might require support or accommodations to participate fully in various aspects of life. And some of those are listed here as well. And again, keeping in mind, this is non-exhaustive. Non-apparent disabilities, sometimes referred to as non-visible or even invisible disabilities, are impairments that are typically not immediately noticeable. They can include conditions like chronic health conditions, like chronic fatigue syndrome, neurological disabilities like seizure disorders, and psychological disabilities like bipolar disorder and learning disabilities. These conditions can significantly impact an individual's life and those major life activities without exhibiting outwardly noticeable physical signs, or may only become evident to others during flare-ups or periods of exacerbation. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There is no exhaustive list under the ADA. So next, we're going to dive into requesting accommodations and engaging in the interactive process, specifically around interviewing, applications, and onboarding. So for individuals with disabilities, requesting accommodations to participate fully in employment sometimes requires performing tasks differently or in a different way, or adjustments to the workspace or workplace and policies as well to ensure equitable access to employment and employment benefits. It's important to keep in mind that these requests do not require magic words and do not have to be in writing. They can include statements like, I need an accommodation for, or it would be helpful if I could use or have, or I need help with, or I could engage more fully in employment if. Keeping in mind, this doesn't mean somebody is automatically entitled to that accommodation, but that these are the statements that will trigger that process so that we can go ahead and ask more information and determine if accommodations are appropriate. In all stages of employment, the goals of the interactive process really are to ensure that the applicants, interviewees, and eventually employees experience an inclusive hiring process, and when appropriate, that IWDs receive those reasonable accommodations to enable them to fully participate and engage in every stage of their employment. Within the interactive process, applicants with disabilities are typically responsible for explaining limitations of the disability and how they relate to their request, while also identifying preferred options and remaining open to alternatives. So if something they identify as a preferred accommodation might not be possible, how would another accommodation assist them? We also want to make sure that applicants as well as interviewees make fact-based decisions, avoiding speculative concerns, and engage in good faith to collaborate effectively in determining the most suitable accommodations for that particular situation. Keep in mind, the applicant does not need to reveal their diagnosis. During the interactive process, employers similarly have their own responsibilities, and they do need to consult with the employee about the limitations, as well as consider the employee's preferred accommodation option if it is possible. Employers have the option to implement the accommodation that is most appropriate both for the employer as well as for the employee. And again, they need to try to avoid what if and make those fact-based decisions with the information that is appropriately available to them. And again, engage in a good faith effort to find a suitable outcome for both. So some examples of interview accommodations that we see frequently are supplying a list of questions in advance of the interview, providing details about interview participants like titles and their photos ahead of time. They can also provide, employers can also provide a tour of the interview space beforehand or the building, utilizing ASL interpreters or Zoom captioning. And allowing support person or service animals, as well as conducting virtual interviews when necessary or appropriate. So at the applicant phase, a variation of the workplace accommodation for employees is used. Usually it's a truncated process, doesn't require as many steps. So when an applicant requests an accommodation directly from a hiring manager, the hiring manager or individual that's responsible for the committee is responsible for determining the reasonableness and implementing the requested accommodation or an alternative if it is deemed appropriate and reasonable under the ADA. If there are uncertainties about how best to support an applicant request or doubts about the request reasonableness, the hiring manager or individual in charge of that application process should definitely contact the Disability Equity Office for assistance. Applicants may also request an accommodation for their application and interview process directly through us, and we would go ahead and contact the hiring manager as appropriate to discuss implementing those accommodations. Just a quick note, if you do receive a request for accommodations as a hiring manager, be sure that you provide a thank you and acknowledge that they have provided this information and for disclosing that need. Also consider providing a response that it's something the unit already does or can do and implement it for the individual. And then finally, if you're not sure, don't wait until you have an answer. Go ahead and let them know that you're going to follow up with the Disability Equity Office, and we'll get back with them as soon as possible. So next, we're going to turn to some accessible hiring practice. So despite being a really rich and diverse source of talent, individuals with disabilities continue to be the most unemployed and underemployed group of individuals. And it really is an untapped group of diverse talent. So to address this, employers can enhance their recruitment efforts by posting job openings with disability organizations, partnering with disability resources, and highlighting aspects of their job that include things like workplace accessibility as well as available flexibility. Hiring, of course, begins with a job description. So it's important to keep in mind how you frame accessibility in the language, and that the language you use does make a difference when trying to attract and recruit employees with disabilities. It's important to remember to write clear and concise job descriptions that are non-technical when appropriate. So we want to focus on the tasks of the job and not how the tasks should be or could be performed. For instance, rather than using walk, use maneuver or traverse. Rather than using words like talking or hearing or listening, use things like communicating, or for things like lifting and carrying, instead use move or transport. You want to also make sure that we're setting up individuals for positive experiences in hiring by clearly articulating the essential job functions and percentages of those job functions, really indicating the environmental and physical requirements when necessary in a job. For example, if you're going to be outside all the time in varying degrees of weather, it's really important to include that information for individuals with disabilities who may have sensitivities to extreme temperatures. You also want to indicate the availability of flexible work when appropriate, and also be very clear if that is not going to be an option. Job description language can often be discouraging, so please be sure you use inclusive language. And of course, if you're interested in more as well, more information on inclusive language, as well as some tools we have here at the university, please feel free to reach out. Also, at the applicant phase, as well as in the job description phase, include information about requesting accommodations. So moving to our in-person interview, when we're conducting in-person interviews, it's really crucial to implement accessible practices to ensure all candidates have an equitable and inclusive experience. It's important to consider impacts of the senses and how they can affect an individual's focus in those interviews as well. For example, if someone's distracted during the interview, odds are you're not going to be assessing their performance at their best. So we want to keep in mind physical barriers to access that might exist in the interview space, being sure to clear pathways through doors, hallways, and restroom entrances to increase access for individuals with mobility limitations, as well as pathways for wheelchairs. Consider the impact of multisensory environments, including sights and smells, that could create barriers for individuals as well. Try to hold your interviews in places that allow for dimmers or reduced lighting, as well as a low sensory room, or avoiding having an interview near a construction site, which I know can be difficult at times on the university campus. It's also important to provide as much information in advance, like dates, times, the time frames, how long an interview will take, available parking, particularly if it's a difficult area to traverse or you know that parking is an issue in a particular area, as well as information about lactation spaces, scheduled breaks if it's an all-day type interview scenario, as well as providing an agenda and titles of individuals ahead of time, if possible. So for our virtual or hybrid interviews, of course, for hybrid, our tips on the last slide continue to apply. If you are hosting virtual or hybrid interviews, it's important, of course, to provide as much information, again, ahead of time that you can. Also, try to avoid any last minute changes, whether that's a new Zoom link or there is an issue with a particular location due to the audio visual components. If you're able to provide a virtual attendance option for your interviews, that is a fantastic option as well. And the University of Michigan's ITS, hosting accessible remote events, also has great tips and information about what to consider for these hybrid and remote interviews. Also include resources for attendees, both virtually as well as for those attending in person. So information including paratransit or parking maps, as well as providing Zoom captioning by default, as well as providing CART or ASL interpreters when requested. Keeping in mind, Zoom captioning does not meet the ADA standards or replace CART or ASL when either of those two accommodations are requested. Some additional considerations to keep in mind when engaging in hybrid and virtual interviews and meetings include having each speaker identifying themselves every time they speak. So beginning a sentence with, "This is Allison," and when I hand it over to another speaker, that speaker would then identify themselves. This allows participants, captainers, and interpreters for a bit of space so that individuals don't overlap each other with content, but also helps provide a more clear transcript and understanding. Be sure that you know how to spotlight an ASL interpreter feed and how to set up and use Zoom and CART caption, or excuse me, Zoom captioning and CART transcription. Be sure that you're reading questions or comments. If people are engaging or asking questions in the chat for your applicant or interviewee, be sure that you are reading those out loud. Be sure that you're enabling your camera when you're speaking, when at all possible, and reduce background noise and visual distractions. Consider not utilizing moving virtual backgrounds. So no palm trees and waves. Those can really be distracting and also provide some challenges for individuals with certain disabilities. And of course, as you're reading or providing an interview question, if you're doing this in a hybrid manner, go ahead and place the interview questions in the chat as you go, or have a copy of the questions printed out in accessible larger print than you might usually utilize, available for the individual to follow along with if needed. So beyond providing requested accommodations for individuals with disabilities, there are changes that you can make to create more inclusive practices just overall for everybody in your hiring processes, keeping in mind that many individuals prefer not to disclose their need for accommodations at the interview and application stages because of concerns related to stigma, discrimination, prior experiences, etc. So to create more inclusive environments for successful interviews, you can utilize some of these practices and make small changes that can have a really big impact. So just ensure by default Zoom captioning is turned on. Offer multiple interview times, a couple in the morning and a couple in an afternoon, allowing individuals to rank for their preferences. Typically, we'll provide 3 different times, usually beginning and end of day or middle of day, to allow people who perform better in one or the other to have that ability to choose. You can consider providing questions and scenarios ahead of time. This has been shown to elicit greater and more in-depth answers from participants. Keep the size of their interviewing group manageable. Really consider how many people need to be in a first and second interview. Ensure that the hiring managers and those responsible for scheduling are aware of accommodation resources, expectations for performance standards, as well as are aware of disability etiquette and how to avoid ableist thinking throughout these interview and application processes as well.
Allison, this is Erin
Yes.
interrupting with a question for you from our chat.
Okay.
Would it be a better practice for applicants to let a hiring manager know about their need for accommodation, or to offer an option for the applicant to reach out to someone who is not on the hiring committee?
That's a great question. It depends on the ability or how many people that you may have available. If you're working with an HR partner for the unit, it is absolutely appropriate to have that person reach out to a specific contact, especially if you're able to utilize that contact all of the time. So you have the same person providing accommodation information in a consistent way and addressing those requests. Sometimes it does need to be your hiring committee or someone on that committee. If that's the case, again, you're going to want to make sure that you provide instruction to the committee that the information that's been provided is confidential, and to do your best to not consider that information in decision making. That's a really good question. So, moving on to onboarding and retention tips. Providing employees with the tools they need to be successful allows you to create a more welcoming and productive space. It also reduces workplace injury if we're looking at ergonomic options. So, access really does mean allowing choices. It's important to remember that the accessibility and disability needs of individuals change over time. So, of course, it's fantastic to offer these ergonomic options or flexibility options to individuals when they begin their position. But keep in mind that it's a really great practice to check in after hire and then maybe 1 to 2 times a year about access needs or changes. This can be done by providing an annual reminder to your team about resources that are available for a wide range of things, and reminding people to, discuss with their manager if their needs have changed, as well as providing kind of a list of the items that might be available for people, like alternative lighting or different ergonomic options. And continue to do that in a low-key way, 1 to 2 times per year, just to make sure that you're checking in not only with those who may not have been comfortable asking for accommodations at the beginning of their employment, but also because everybody's needs change over time. So, accessible onboarding day one, before day one. So, provide information around how to request accommodations once that offer letter and communications have gone back and forth and there's an acceptance. Provide information about accessible parking and transportation options before someone's first day. Provide a tentative schedule of the first few days or even a week that lays out the expectations for who they'll be meeting with, provide links, etc. Keeping in mind not everybody has access to all systems or their email the first day or so. So keep in mind that you want to provide them with those links somewhere separately so that if there is an issue with technology getting set up, you are good to go. And be sure that the systems and programs, as well as the documents you're utilizing in your onboarding, are accessible. And we have plenty of events and upcoming events on creating accessible documents for those interested in learning more about that as well. So on day one, you're going to want to go ahead and provide a tour of the overall physical space if they're in person, as well as their individual office space, and highlight information about emergency planning, accessible entrances, exits, bathrooms, etc. Go ahead and assist the employee and introduce them to staff. Schedule time for staff to meet and greet the employee either individually or in small group settings afterwards. Meeting a lot of people all at once can be incredibly overwhelming. It is for me. And I know that providing smaller opportunities for people to get to know each other, or at least get to know what everybody does, can be incredibly helpful, maybe a few days or a week out. Reflect organizational culture in your benefits and supports. So let people know that what is available to them, whether that is flexible schedules, the importance of work-life balance, as well as sharing information about resource groups and shared experiences. So you could, of course, provide in your onboarding documents language around it's important to us that employees have and maintain a work-life balance, and to ensure that we provide employees tools they need, offering flexible schedules that might allow you to take, for example, certain afternoons off, etc. You can also point them in the direction of employee resource groups to allow them to connect with their colleagues, and then share some of those known resource groups and employee affiliated groups as well. For accessible onboarding, including training, it's important that the training provides real-time experiences and expectations at the beginning. So be sure that you are sharing accessible training resources and guides. Provide task-oriented training and shadowing opportunities, not only with individuals who perform the same task, but sometimes it's helpful for individuals, depending on how they interact or their jobs interact with others, to supervise, or excuse me, to shadow those individuals as well. And of course, schedule check-ins with the manager or supervisor within the first week and weekly for new employees to ask questions or feedback. And then, of course, along the way. Provide clear expectations. So again, this goes back to having a very well written job description with information about how people are spending their day and what the requirements are. Of course, discuss the needs and preferences of how they receive the information, including format preferences, how they would like feedback, whether it's in writing, whether it's orally, whether it is very direct, or whether if it's a bit softer in its delivery, as well as how they want to be provided support. We can also go ahead and be sure to provide performance feedback, as well as the good and areas for improvement as well.
Allison, this is Erin jumping in with another question for you. Is there a template or a checklist that might be available to go over some of the accessible onboarding options that you've discussed? I see in some of your notes that you did have a link there. Would you like me to share that in the chat for everyone?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great start. And I believe we also have some of these resources that we're working to provide in a few of our upcoming presentations as well. And we're working on some material for relaunching our website. So check back soon and we should have some really great content for you as well. Another great question. Thank you. So beyond just hiring and onboarding, we want to consider how to create disability inclusive retention. So it's important that once we find these employees, that we retain them because they provide value to our organization as a whole. So really, for all employees, encouraging them to participate in professional developments, and provide leadership opportunities if somebody is interested in those, as well as the ability to sit on committees and get different types of experience. Of course, it's going to vary based on everybody's job as well as the progression of their responsibilities. But studies have shown that individuals with disabilities are least often selected for things like leadership opportunities and additional professional development. So be sure that you're offering that to everyone. It's important to foster an open and communicative supervisory relationship. So try to keep the door open. Be sure to address issues as they arise. Everybody's situation on this is going to look different. But these are ways to make sure that individuals feel comfortable going to their supervisor to request accommodations or flexibility when needed, while maintaining appropriate production values. So allow flexible working opportunities when possible and check in over time to make sure that those options are still working. Provide process and procedure manuals that you routinely update and link to workflows and resources where appropriate, as well as creatively, excuse me. We want to be sure that we remember that everybody learns differently and that the opportunities for everybody may not work for each individual person. So keep in mind different modalities and try to provide a wide variety and ask for input and feedback. Make sure that individuals who have gone through your onboarding process help you to determine, especially if they're coming from outside the university or from different units or departments or at different times and places in their employment journey. Allow them to provide you with some feedback around what that experience was like and how you might want to consider changing it or making some slight different choices. All right, so we're going to take a few minutes to discuss the most frequently asked questions when it comes to interviewing and hiring practices. So when should an employer ask an applicant if they need an accommodation? Now, again, we've gone over some of this, but we've included here some suggested language about when somebody is requesting it during all of the stages. So we've got for the job posting listed here, how to request an accommodation, in the offer of an interview, information on how they would do that when you send those requests out. And keep in mind that an employer can't ask questions about the applicant's disability either because it's apparent or because the applicant has voluntarily disclosed a non-apparent disability. So keep that in mind. Does the ADA require an employer to provide an individual with disabilities an interview accommodation? Hopefully by now we all know the answer to that is yes. And within this slide deck, there's going to be a link to some guidance from the EEOC about what is appropriate and what can and cannot be requested or asked of applicants during this process as well. So this is a really good one. Does an applicant, we get this asked quite a bit. Does an applicant need to tell the employer during the application process that they might need an accommodation if they are hired? The answer to that is no. So some applicants choose to inform an employer during the application process or interview process after they better understand the job and its requirements. Others will choose to wait until they have an offer, and some may not even disclose or request anything till much later, and they see if they need something in the form of an accommodation after being hired. It's important to remember that determining the best moment to tell your prospective employer about the need for a reasonable accommodation on the job is a very personal decision. And really the only question you're able to ask during this pre-offer period is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? So keep that in mind, and remember that there is no requirement for an employee to disclose or request accommodations for a job before they're hired for it. So here we have listed some questions that the ADA prohibits us from asking because they are questions that may elicit or are likely to elicit a disability disclosure before making a job offer, which is known as the pre-offer period. So some of those are listed here. How many days were you sick last year? Have you ever filed for workers' compensation? Have you ever been injured on the job? Have you ever been treated for mental health disorders? And again, these do come from real cases that were filed with the EEOC. People have actually asked these questions. So keep that in mind and be sure that the questions you ask are not going to elicit some sort of a disclosure. If somebody answers that they are able to perform the job functions with or without a reasonable accommodation, the guidance suggests that if the answer is yes, there's no reason to ask any further questions at that time. Employees with disabilities can, of course, engage in the interactive process once hired to determine what those accommodations may be that would assist them in performing those job duties. So, must the employer keep medical information disclosed during the hiring process confidential? Absolutely. One caveat I want to mention to this is that while there's many different schools of thought about disclosing disability status or even diagnosis in interviews or application materials, generally we do recommend people don't provide diagnoses information in an interview or in their application materials. But if it is provided, the hiring committee has to set that information aside in its decision making and ensure the materials are absolutely kept confidential. While that diagnosis shouldn't be shared, the limitations or restrictions might be shared in this situation on a need to know basis. For example, when they need a accommodation to engage in that process for hiring or interviewing. So what if an applicant's disability prevents them from performing some job duties? So the applicant or employee is only considered qualified if they can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. However, an employer can't reject an applicant because a disability interferes or prevents them from doing a non-essential job function, or what we would call an ancillary task. If you get to the point in an interview process and you come across a situation like this, you don't need to make this decision by yourself. Please reach out to our office and we can help walk you through that type of question, as well as figuring out if indeed this is a situation where you would not need to move forward, or if we need to consider having a more in-depth conversation about available accommodations. So, some of those examples of what would be and wouldn't be essential job functions. So essential functions for a file clerk are to file and retrieve written materials. If the description also states the clerk has to answer the phone, but in practice, the clerk rarely does this because there's other employees who have that essential job responsibility, the employer is not going to be able to reject the applicant just because they're unable to answer a phone. We want to discuss potential options as a backup and what might be available, because this isn't an essential part of performing that job. We might be able to use speech recognition software to input data for somebody who has limitations for that file clerk job as well. So if an accommodation is provided to one applicant, does it need to be provided to everyone to maintain equity? The answer to this is no. So the purpose of an interview and hiring process accommodation is to provide equal access for the individual with a disability, which there inherently makes it equitable. So providing an individual with disabilities interview questions in advance based on their limitations and requests. However, again, many studies have shown that it is best to provide questions in advance to all applicants, which can create a much more equitable and accessible process with better outcomes. Again, not always appropriate maybe some of the questions or a particular scenario that you want somebody to present to you would be appropriate. But no, you do not need to provide it to everybody. It is specifically to provide that level playing field. So we've come to our interactive activity, interviewing and hiring case scenarios. So what we're going to do is present some facts of a situation, and we're going to also provide you with the accommodations that were requested for that individual's disability. And then we'll ask you to come up with some additional options as well. All right, and with me to help provide some support for any of the information that you put into the chats about this will be our senior accessibility specialist, Erin. So here's our first situation. The facts. The employer holds interviews via Zoom with their entire team on a call. Martin has autism and anxiety and has difficulty processing information in crowded and high stress settings, such as an interview. So he's requested to have the interview questions in advance and to have his camera off during the interview. So what's our resolution? In this situation, the employer modified the interview procedure to accommodate the disability related needs. He can receive the interview questions in advance and turn off his camera as needed. What additional accommodations might be helpful for somebody who might have anxiety or an autistic individual in these types of high stress or highly crowded interview processes? And I'll leave it to Erin to provide us any of the items that might have come up in our chat.
This is Erin speaking. So for anyone on the call, if you would like to put your answers into the chat, only the hosts and panelists will be able to see those. So you won't have those popping up for any other attendees. So what we're looking for is any other type of accommodation that may be assistive for Martin in the interview process. So we have one individual who has typed in that turning off the camera as needed, but perhaps turning it on when Martin is speaking. Another has stated hosting an interview with a smaller hiring committee. We have another comment of offering breaks between the interview questions. Another of providing a list of the interview team along with links to their pictures or profiles. So quite a few really good answers in there for some excellent accommodation alternatives that might also assist Martin.
Definitely. All right, moving to case scenario number 2. We've got a situation that requires job applicants to apply for a job in person. So this requires lining up outside, awaiting one's turn, which could take several hours. Bill has a spinal cord injury, making it difficult for him to tolerate prolonged exposure to various temperatures due to challenges and limitations with thermoregulation. So Bill requests he be allowed to wait indoors where it's temperature controlled until the Human Resources Department is ready to take his application. So here in this situation, the employer modified the hiring practices to accommodate his needs. He's able to wait indoors in a temperature controlled environment until it's his turn. So looking here for some alternatives to that option, thinking creatively.
This is Erin again. So we've got a couple of answers coming into the chat already. And many of them actually that are coming in are talking about modifying the type of interview instead of an in-person interview to a Zoom or an online virtual interview.
Excellent.
We also have another comment that came in of giving Bill a particular time for his appointment or to create an appointment rather than having him wait in a line.
Yeah, that's a really great option as well. All right. My clicker doesn't want to move forward right now. There we go. All right. Number 3. So we have an applicant that receives a phone interview time slot of an hour, but Yasmin has anxiety and a mild speech disorder that makes verbal responses take longer and can cause her voice to fatigue. She requests that she be allowed to meet in person, receive questions in advance, and to respond to interview questions in writing rather than responding verbally. So here, the employer modified the interview format to allow Yasmin's disability-related needs. What additional accommodations might be helpful in this scenario?
This is Erin speaking. I think we might have some trouble with this one. We're not getting a lot of answers coming in yet. So as a reminder, this this applicant has a mild speech disorder and some anxiety. They have difficulties with verbal responses. So the request was to meet in person, receive questions in advance, and respond in writing to those interview questions. So our question for everyone here on the call is, what accommodation options could be really helpful for this applicant in processing those questions during their interview? Okay, so we do have a couple of options coming in. Reducing the time frame of the interview to only 30 minutes. We have someone else who says to increase the interview time to allow for break periods. We have another answer of allowing the option of either written or verbal responses to questions as well.
Excellent. Those are really great options. And again, another could be providing those questions ahead of time. Some more creative responses that I've seen is allowing somebody to pre-record their responses as well, which of course not done as often, but could be a potential option, especially if it is something related to, let's say, a technical presentation for somebody who may need to showcase their skills. So another option as well. All right. Scenario 4 is that Sadie is blind and has been invited to participate in pre-employment testing. However, the testing center is in a building Sadie has never been to, and even employees who are explaining the building to them describe it as being easy to get lost in. So, what accommodations might assist Sadie?
This is Erin speaking. We have a couple of responses coming in already. Allowing someone to meet Sadie at the entrance to assist with navigation. We have someone stating that we can allow a companion to assist Sadie in navigating the building. We have someone who has offered to provide some extra additional information ahead of time and offering a tour.
Excellent. Those are all awesome options. And here they did provide a tour to the pre-employment, prior to the pre-employment testing date. And again, had somebody meet the applicant at the entrance on the testing date. That's also a really great practice for individuals on their first day of work. So if they are eventually hired, meeting somebody at the front door, being sure that they're not wandering around with no idea who to connect with is also a great way just to make an individual feel comfortable and could potentially be providing assistance to someone with a disability that needs additional wayfinding assistance. All right. So we've reached the end of our scenarios. Thank you all for your participation and the good questions. We wanted to provide some resources for you as well as for applicants. There are links here over the next few pages that will provide information about accessible parking, paratransit services that may be available to staff, accessible parking at the Michigan Medicine campus, construction maps, and lactation room locations. And finally, with a couple of minutes left, we'll open it up for any additional questions anybody may have.
Allison, this is Erin. We have had a couple of questions, kind of all a bit similar.
Okay.
It seems like a few of our participants are having difficulty understanding when or how to understand if someone is just asking for questions ahead of time or if it's related to a disability. So, for example, this question is if an interviewee says, "Can I have questions in advance?" They're going to help me prepare for the interview. How do we determine if this is just someone who wants them in advance or if it's someone with a disability?
Sure. So I would say the easiest way to determine that is if you utilize one of those sentences in your offer to interview that states if you need an accommodation to participate. And perhaps you've listed CART or Zoom captioning will be available. If you need anything additional, please contact us. If that response came in, as a part of an interview request, and it was that vague, you could absolutely consider that they were answering that question in the affirmative, that they did need that related to a disability. If you really want to make sure, and the question does not mention a condition, you could just simply ask, is your request related to a disability or medical condition? And I would really recommend including, please do not disclose the diagnosis at the end of that if you are going to require that they answer that question. It's perfectly fine to ask for clarification. Just be sure you ask in a general way and don't elicit any of that disability related diagnosis information when you ask. Great question.
This is Erin again. We don't have any further open questions at this time.
Wonderful. Well, with that, thank you all for joining me today. And thank you to our wonderful ASL interpreters and our CART captioner and for your questions. And if you have any questions that come up afterwards, or you need to contact us or are interested in attending other events, please be sure to check out our events and contact us. Again, thanks so much, and we will see you next time.